Yep.
So let me see if I can share my screen. So are you seeing that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So hi everybody. Sorry for the technical issues, especially if it's a problem at my end. I guess we're all used to this kind of thing now in a kind of post-COVID world. So I guess some of you have seen the Ultimate Tut film. I hope you have. If you have, thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I just wanted to kind of update you a bit because since we made that film, some new evidence has come to light. It's actually quite old, that film. We made it in 2012, so a little bit over 10 years ago now. And at the time, you might remember from the film, we were proposing that Tutankhamun might have been killed in a chariot accident. And the reason we thought that that was at least a possibility is that the X-rays of his mummy seemed to show that he'd suffered some kind of injury in a line down the left-hand side of his chest, his torso. There was some ribs missing, and a part of the bone around the hip area missing too. So we thought, what could cause this? And we came up with, as you may know from the film, of this idea that he was hit by the wheel of a chariot. The chariot wheel, if it hit him kind of straight on, might cause those kinds of injuries. And if the chariot was going fast enough, could have killed him. So that all seemed reasonable to us at the time. But since then, as I say, some new evidence has come to light. So this, I hope you can see this, and my apologies if anybody is uncomfortable with viewing images of human remains. I guess if you've seen the film, then you'll already be familiar with seeing images of ancient human remains like this. This is the body of the king. And this is a photograph that was taken in 1926, not long after the tomb of Tutankhamun was discovered. It was discovered 100 years ago in 1922. It took Howard Carter, actually a couple of years to get to the mummy itself, to the point where he could examine it scientifically. And after he did, this photograph was taken. And as you can see here, it shows actually some of the ribs you can see kind of underneath some of the remains of the bandages and actually what's the remains of his soft tissue, his skin and muscles, that kind of thing. So the ribs that we thought were in fact the ribs that are missing now, so they don't show up in the X-rays that we do now or CT scans that have been were still there in 1926. The other thing is that there are other things that were still there in 1926 that are now missing. For example, a kind of collar, like an elaborate piece of jewelry, lots of beads and things that he wore around here, and also like a little skull cap, which was made of beads as well. And that was still on the king's head in 1926, but they're not there now. So this is a bit of a mystery. What's happened? This is the skull cap, by the way. It's an amazing thing, as you can see. It's made of tiny little beads, which have been arranged into the shape of two cobras here on the top of his. This is the top of his head. And this is a photograph of the jewelry that he was wearing at the top of his chest. This collar.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, you can hear me, correct?
I can. Yeah.
All right. Can you go back to the skull? You're very, it's coming in a little shaky. Can you go over that again? We have never seen that.
Yeah, that's new for us.
That's really new for us. Yeah, that piece in here with it looks like jewelry, and then the back of the skull.
Okay, so if I start from here, would that be okay?
Now, yeah, that's fine.
Shall I go from here?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So so this is a skull cap which is on the king's head. I'm sorry, this is a very gruesome photograph of the head of the king detached from the body. But it's important.
Frozen.
Now, but it might help us to explain why it is that I now think a chariot accident is less likely. So this skull cap was still there, and this is a photograph of the top of the king's chest. It's this kind of area here, just beneath his neck, and this is these little things here, these little tiny things. These are hundreds and hundreds of little beads. And at the bottom, these larger things are pendants. We call them pendants. They're made of gold. They're kind of shaped like big drops. And these were also still on the mummy in 1926. At the time when the mummy was left it was put back in the tomb by Howard Carter and his team. That's important. Most mummies, when they're discovered by archaeologists, are removed and usually placed somewhere very safe, like a museum or a storage facility. Very unusually, in the case of Tutankhamun's body, it was put back in the tomb and left there because Carter felt that that was suitable. And the tomb, of course, was going to become a tourist attraction, so it was guarded. And that meant that Carter and the Antiquities Service could be confident that it would be safe and secure in there. So all these things were still there in 1926, and they're now gone. And a few years ago, these things turned up for sale on the antiquities market. And a colleague of mine called Marc Gabold, who's a French Egyptologist, spotted these for sale and very cleverly recognized that these golden droplet-shaped items are the same items that were found on the collar that were supposed to have been left in the tomb with Tutankhamun in 1926 and should still be there. So because they've come onto the market and have been sold, we can see that somebody must have entered the tomb sometime between 1926 and I think it was 2015. These things came on sale. Somebody entered the tomb and robbed it and took these things so that they could sell them. We don't have any information about when that happened, but perhaps it happened at a time when the security was a little bit lax, perhaps during the Second World War, when, for obvious reasons, the tomb wasn't defended to the same extent that it would be normally. And we think that probably at the same time as these things were being removed, the collar from here and also the cap, and this damaged the mummy. And that's why the ribs were missing. So the fact that the ribs don't show up in the X-rays now is not caused by any kind of accident that the king suffered during his lifetime. It's the result of robbery sometime probably in the 20th century. So for that reason, we can rule out the whole idea of a chariot crash. We have to look for a different explanation. So just a couple more slides. This is these are other things which have been discovered on the antiquities market, which also probably come from the tomb from the same robberies. And it's, of course, it's the fact that Tutankhamun's mummy was left in the tomb. That's how this all happened. So there's an interesting discussion to be had around whether it was a good idea to leave the body in the tomb or not. There's not really any right or wrong answer about that because there are pros and cons in both cases. It's nice that the king is still in his tomb, but it does mean that unfortunately his body's been damaged by robbers as a result in the relatively recent past. So there we go. That's what I wanted to tell you. And I wanted to tell you that because, well, it's a nice little update to the film. So I hope that was useful. If you have any questions about that or anything else, I'd be happy to answer them.
So Dr. Naunton, you were just saying that the reason the ribs were gone, not because of the chariot accident itself, but because grave robbers went in there and actually removed bones, including whatever the jewelry was that was on the chest. That's a great piece. Yeah. That's a huge piece for us. We have a lot of students in here who have chosen the chariot accident as the possible death. But I'm glad you're here to explain to us now that might not be the case. We will see.
All right, so I'm Jamie, by the way, who you've been communicating with on the email. So nice to see you.
Hi, Jamie. Nice to meet you.
As well. Okay, so we're gonna have some students ask some questions now. Jeremy, if you want to raise, just make sure you're nice and loud so Dr. Naunton can hear you all the way.
Dr. Naunton, can you see them?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Go ahead, Jeremy. Nice and loud.
Hello, Dr. Naunton. I'd like to ask you, from your professional standpoint, what do you believe to be the most likely cause of cut death?
Well, that is the $64 million question, isn't it? I think in some ways the new evidence is quite helpful because we speculated for a long time that the chariot crash could be the cause. I should say that we can't really rule that out still. But the evidence we were using before, which is all this damage on the mummy, isn't there now. So the case for that's much weaker. What we can say is that, first of all, Tutankhamun's mummy is very strange. It's very unusual. It's unusual in that the heart of the king is not present in the mummy. And although the Egyptians removed certain internal organs as part of the mummification process to help preserve the body, the heart normally was left in the body. And it's not there, and we don't know why. The Egyptians also made a little cut in the body to remove internal organs, and that cut on Tutankhamun's mummy is in the wrong place, and it's much too big, which makes it look like whoever did the mummification didn't know what they were doing. The other thing is that his mummy exhibits some unusual features. He's got funny feet, which might be the evidence of a genetic condition that might have meant that he had trouble walking, but it might not. And finally, there is a nasty cut on his leg around the area of his left knee. And that cut was open when he died. We can tell that because the embalming oils that are used for mummification have seeped inside that cut. So it must have been open when he died. That cut actually, I mean, doesn't sound like very much. You know, I'm sure everybody here at some point has cut their leg. I know I have, and you know, I'm still here, and you guys all are too. But it's possible that cut became infected. And let's not forget that infections in the ancient world before penicillin and antibiotics were a much, much bigger problem than they are for us now. So the cut on the leg is really the only, clue that we have, or it's the best clue that we have. The fact is that he might have died from something that left no trace on the mummy. So, for example, we now know that unfortunately some people have, for example, issues with their circulation or their heart, which can cause them to have a heart attack even at a young age. And Tutankhamun was very young. We know that he was about 20 years old, a little bit less. He could have just had a heart attack and dropped dead completely unexpectedly. And if he had, then we would see no evidence of that in the mummy at all. Similarly, there are lots of other conditions that could have killed him and left no trace at all. You know, if he'd had a virus, he'd had some kind of an infection, we wouldn't necessarily know. So it's a very long answer. I'm sorry, you probably regret asking the question now. But the cut on the knee is the closest thing we have to a kind of smoking gun, if you like. But is it enough for us to say definitely that's what killed him? No. So can we say with any certainty how he died? No. And at the moment, I don't think we will ever certainly know until we have a time machine and can go back and find out.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. All right,
Thank you, Dr. Naunton.
next one is Isabella.
Isabella.
Hi.
You have your name left.
Your next
Hi.
Hi.
Do you think I was responsible for Ted's death? And is there any proof that I may have had a grudge against Ted?
Good question. Thanks. So, there's no
Dr. Naunton,
evidence.
that seems to be our second most popular thesis for most of our papers here. It was murdered by the murder.
Okay. I can see why. I'm sorry to tell you, there's no evidence for it at all. Unless unless you include one or two things that you might consider to be, I suppose, what we'd call circumstantial evidence. So what we know is that I became pharaoh. You know, and Tutankhamun died without having had any children, as far as we know. So there wasn't anybody obvious to succeed him. Somebody has to take over as king. And and you can imagine that, if there was a kind of a race, if you like, or a competition, there would suddenly be lots of people who would want to be the king because it makes you very rich and very powerful. In fact, it makes you into a kind of a god. So you can imagine there would be lots of people who wanted to do that. And, I wins that competition. So was he a nice guy? Don't know. And perhaps he did all sorts of nasty things in order to put himself at the front of the line to be the king. But we don't know that. I might have been an incredibly nice old guy that everybody loved, who, was everyone's first choice to take over. It would have been probably a very sad time. Tutankhamun dies very young. We don't know how. It was I think it probably was unexpected. And there's nobody to take over because he's got no children. This is a disaster for Egypt. Maybe I didn't even want to do it. But everybody said, oh, come on, look, you've got the most experience. Everybody likes you. Please, why don't you take over? Sometimes, as you probably know, some people suggest that the tomb that I was buried in, which is really like Tutankhamun's, but it's just bigger and nicer. They sometimes think, well, that was probably the tomb that was meant for Tutankhamun. So hang on, how come I ended up being buried there? Maybe he stole it. But then actually, if Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, maybe it wasn't ready. Maybe they had to bury Tutankhamun somewhere else because the tomb just wasn't fit to receive his burial. So Tutankhamun has to be buried somewhere else. And then what else are you going to do with the other tomb that was meant for Tutankhamun? Well, you might as well finish it and then give it to the next king. So, so sometimes people want to see that, I think, as I kind of doing the dirty on Tutankhamun, but we don't know that. I think if you try and persuade yourselves that he was a nice guy, and you'll see that that's just as possible.
So to that end, on that question, what about Tut's wife? Was she forced to marry him? Was that the nature of royalty at the time? Was she forced to marry because I read somewhere that I was her grandfather?
So we don't.
The reaction of the crowd.
Again, unfortunately, we just don't know these things. we have a little we have a couple of little hints that I might have been connected to the royal family. In which case that could help partly explain why he became the king. He's not part of the main part of the royal family, but he might be connected, and that might have made it a bit easier for people to take. As for whether or not Ankhesenamun was happy to marry Tutankhamun or not, again, we have, unfortunately, the evidence we have just doesn't give us any idea really about people's personalities. All it tells us is the kind of official line of events. So the king is the king, and the king has to have a wife, and the wife probably is going to have to come from the royal family. So already, his choices are fairly limited. It's probably true to say that whoever was chosen to be his wife probably wouldn't have had much say in it. Having said that, they might have really liked each other. We don't know. Maybe Tutankhamun was the hot stuff, and Ankhesenamun was also the hot stuff, and everybody thought, wow, these two should get together, and they just did. But we just can't know those things. I think it's probably true that if you look right across Egyptian history, there will have been times when a king marries his queen, a man marries a woman, and they just didn't like each other at all. But equally, I think it's only, they were only human beings like we are. I think it's equally likely that in some cases, the people who got married really, really did love each other and got on, and it was great, and it was fine, and they were very happy.
Totally fair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, question 4.
Good afternoon. Is there any new evidence, particularly why this tomb was rushed?
Oh, good question. Nothing. There's nothing really that's new. I don't think. So what we have is a tomb which is, as you probably already know, it's too small. It's undecorated. Are you hearing me okay, or?
Yeah, you're just very choppy. You're starting to freeze, and yeah, I know we can't get the whole answer. It's okay.
Okay. So I'll just carry on, and I'll keep my fingers crossed that you can hear me. Yeah, so the tomb is too small. It's not fully decorated. There's some parts of the design that make it look like it might have been prepared for a female rather than for a male.
Those who think about the female.
The other thing about it is that the other thing which is really very weird is that a lot of the burial equipment was made for somebody else originally. So it's a little bit like a whole ton of stuff was made to be buried with a particular pharaoh, and then somebody changed their mind and took all of that stuff that was meant for one pharaoh and rubbed out the names where it says the name of the king and writes Tutankhamun over the top, and then buries it with Tutankhamun. Now that seems weird. The problem with trying to understand how weird that is that we don't have the burial equipment for any, or hardly anything, for any other king or queen from that period. So if we had anything like that, it would make it much easier for us to compare Tutankhamun's situation with the situation of other kings and queens, and then we could say whether it's really weird or not. But as we don't, maybe it wasn't that unusual. So yeah, there's nothing really very new on that. But people are still arguing about it. My feeling is that it all looks as though it's all a bit wrong, and probably the tomb was chosen because it was ready. The king died unexpectedly, and it was there, and they could use it, and they didn't have enough time to build a proper tomb. I think that's a good interpretation. But again, we can't really know.
Naunton said that pretty much everything in the tube was wrong. So we kind of agree with all of that. That is, yeah, they agree with you, Dr. Naunton, that the tube just doesn't look correct. There's like a lot of things that were definitely off. I do
Yes.
kind of sure.
Yeah, great. I'm glad we all agree.
Oh, we're good.
All right, next is Alicia. You've answered part of this question already, but Alicia, your question.
Hello.
Hi.
Is there evidence Tut was hated or arrogant, and why was his tomb so small?
Obviously, you answered the second part of that, but is there any evidence that Tut was hated or arrogant or like a really tough leader? Because one of the specialists said that he was like a warmonger, basically.
Again, do you know what? You're probably getting bored of me saying this, but it's very difficult for us to really know that. So what can we say? We can say that Tutankhamun's name was deliberately removed from the later historical records. So a few reigns afterwards, a few kings later, it became very fashionable to create these very long lists of the names of kings. And the Egyptians, what they were trying to do was to create lists of the names of all of the kings going back to the beginning of history. In fact, we know now that they missed people out, but still, you know, it was a good attempt, and you can see what they were trying to do. But they very deliberately left Tutankhamun's name out, and one or two other names as well. So that's odd. We also know that Tutankhamun built temples, that kind of thing, kinds of things that kings do, and that those temples were demolished very, very shortly after he died, very shortly. So that's also, it's not entirely unusual, but it's quite unusual for it to have happened so quickly. So maybe, you know, maybe people were trying to deliberately forget him. Whether that's because he wasn't a very nice guy, or people didn't like his, you know, him personally, I'm not sure. I think it's more likely that he was too closely associated with Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who had tried to change everything in Egypt in a way that was very radical and came to be very unpopular. And because of that, when the changes they made were completely reversed, the Egyptians tried to make it seem as though that period of change never happened. So Akhenaten and Nefertiti are also left out of those lists, along with Tutankhamun. And again, I think if you just think to yourselves that, you know, what does the evidence really tell us? Does it tell us that he was a nasty guy or a nice guy? It doesn't really tell us either, actually. So I think you can sort of believe what you want, really. If he was a lovely bloke, we'd probably still have the same evidence. If he was a horrible person, we'd probably still have the same evidence. So it's up to you, really.
So, Dr. Naunton, the list that they were creating and that he was left off, purposely left off, that was from the National Geographic video, correct? The one that's at Disney Plus? The one
probably. I'm sorry. I've done so many films about Tutankhamun. I'm not really sure now, but yes, certainly that's a typical thing to include. Yeah.
And we've seen them all.
Great.
We're kind of Dr. Naunton fans, big time. Robert.
Hi.
I believe Tut could die from malaria. Why or why not?
Yeah, good question. So, the idea that he might have had malaria, I believe, comes from analysis of his DNA, I think, or analysis of the soft tissue. You know, and as I understand it, I'm not a doctor. I'm sorry. I mean, I am Dr. Naunton, but I'm not a medical doctor. So I can't, and I'm not a specialist in the kind of analysis that has led to that conclusion. But I know that there are people who have those kinds of skills, medical doctors. Some of them say the evidence says he has malaria, and some of them say no, it doesn't. The other thing is that even if he has malaria, of course, what everybody wants to know is if he had it, is that what killed him? And the answer again is maybe, but maybe not. You know, it is perfectly possible to catch malaria and not die from it. It's not a very nice thing to have. I don't recommend it, but it doesn't necessarily kill you. So if it's not too annoying for me to say this, I would say again that it's a possibility. And I think, you know, if I was writing about it, I think I would have to say that some studies have suggested that he might have been suffering from malaria, and therefore that is a possible, it's one of the candidates as a cause for his death. But it is also possible that he wasn't suffering from it, or that even if he was, it didn't kill him. So again, we're sort of left, I think actually, if I can just add to that, a sort of general point about this. If you think about archaeology and Egyptology as being a bit like a kind of detective work, like police detective work, when somebody commits a crime and a detective investigates it, what they have to do, just like archaeologists do, is they have to gather the evidence and they have to draw conclusions. So they say, you know, let's say they find the knife and the knife has blood on, and the knife also has the fingerprints of this person on it. And this person we know is lying about this, and also we know that they were in the right place at the right time, and also they hated the person who was murdered. So altogether, you put all of that together and you say, well, it does seem pretty likely that this person committed the crime, committed the murder. And then it goes to the court, and, you know, the courts have to decide. Sometimes what happens is there's just not very much evidence. So they never find the murder weapon, or they find the murder weapon, but there's no fingerprints on it. Or they find the murder weapon and there's fingerprints on it, but the guy whose fingerprints are on it was definitely in a different country at the time of the murder. So it can't be him, you know? So you don't always have all the right evidence. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's not possible to decide who committed a crime because there's not enough evidence. And in those cases, those things don't even go to court. They just sometimes, sadly, they just fizzle out. And I think what we have to remember is that in archaeology, that's usually the situation. So, you know, archaeology is not as serious as, you know, police detective work. So we can sort of imagine all these things. You know, was Tutankhamun a nice guy or a bad guy? Did he have malaria, or did he die in a chariot crash or whatever? And we can imagine our own scenarios and draw our own conclusions. But if this was a court and it was a criminal case, almost all the time the case would collapse and it would never go to court because there's not enough evidence. That's almost always how it is. So I think it's important to sort of bear that in mind. You know, when we're trying to tell a story of what happened, we have to use all the evidence we have. But I think it's really important always to be kind of open and honest and say, you know, so the evidence makes us think maybe this, but we can't be sure.
Beautiful. All right, we're gonna skip around a little bit. So page 0. This is page who contacted you on your website.
Hi.
Do you think that if his mummification was done properly, cause of death would be easier to determine?
No, I don't think so, actually, because the body is actually, strange to say, it is actually quite well preserved. You know, the mummification process varies from one individual to the next. It varies over time. The Egyptians were always kind of tinkering with it, it seems, like they were trying to make it absolutely perfect. And of course, what they wanted is, you know, is for a person's body to be preserved so that it literally doesn't change at all. We assume that's what they wanted, is that, you know, the body remains exactly in the state it's in when the person died. They never managed that, of course. But at various different times, they were better at it or they were worse at it. So to give you an example, actually, after the time of Tutankhamun, they decided that because the kind of fleshy part of people was decaying too much, they would start stuffing things inside the mouth and the skull to keep the flesh, as if it was sort of, full of fat and muscle and that sort of stuff. And actually, what that means is that those mummies look really weird. They just look kind of like really, fat. So sometimes they got it right and sometimes they got it wrong. And at the time of Tutankhamun, they were doing it really, really well. And even though his mummy is a bit weird, like I was saying, and you're right to kind of hint that it's done badly, it's still quite well preserved, actually. And if anything, the fact that it's weird, like with the heart's missing, like I said, the embalming incision is in the wrong place and it's too big. There is packing in the torso where the internal organs should have been and weren't. If anything, that actually there's a kinds of clues that something happened. It's just that we can't really say what.
Excellent. I didn't know about the stuffing.
Yeah.
And everything. That's interesting. Stuffing in the mouth to keep the fleshy parts from.
Yeah, that's right. They went in for kind of packing the flesh, and then they went in for at a similar time actually for things like false eyes. So these mummies look really weird. Really gruesome, because the false eyes make them look like they're alive, but they're horrible and sort of bloated, and they're misshapen. They look very strange.
All right, gentlemen.
Right. What is the most interesting and least fact you know about Tut?
If you didn't hear that, what is the most interesting and least known fact about Tut that you can share with us? Something that doesn't come up in discussion.
Well, you guys know so much about Tut. I'm almost nervous to say anything because you'll probably tell me that you already know it. I like the fact that you probably know this already. But being a bit juvenile and having a kind of juvenile sense of humor, I like the fact that Tutankhamun's underpants are preserved in the tomb. I think one of my favorite things actually about him, which is maybe a little bit more serious, is that it's easy to forget that because we all know him as the boy king, this young. Actually, he was a young man. He wasn't a boy, wasn't a child. He was a young man. He was probably about 18 or 19, so fully grown. But he was very young. We know that because of the mummy, which wasn't found until until Carter discovered the tomb. Prior to that, he could have been any age. Could have been 100. It was only the discovery of the mummy that showed us how young he was. The other thing is that we know, well, we have a pretty good idea of how young he was when he became king because of a series of wine jars that were found in the tomb. So Tutankhamun was buried with wine and beer and lots of different kinds of food. The idea being that he would need to feed himself in the afterlife with all the delicious things that he would eat and drink in the earthly life. So he took these things with him, and they literally did leave wine, beer, and meat, bread, cakes, all these sorts of things in the tomb with him. And the jars of wine have labels on them that say where the wine came from, what kind of wine it was, a little sort of description about what it tasted like, and also when it was made. And the date is given as a year in the reign of the king. So they didn't use the same sort of year system that we would. So it doesn't say like, 1341 BC. It would say year such and such in the reign of the king. And the highest number of year that we have for Tutankhamun comes from one of those wine jars. And because of that, we know that he reigned around 8 or 9 years. So working backwards, if he's 19 when he died, and we know that he reigned for, let's say, at least 8 years, then he was 10 or 11 years old when he came to the throne. That's the reason why we call him the Boy King. So I like the idea that it's the combination of the mummy and the wine jar that allow us to say that. I don't know if that's really interesting or something you didn't already know, but I like it anyway.
We didn't know that. We did not know that.
Good.
Good. Yeah. All right, Jesse, your last one here.
Your question up here.
Hi.
Hi.
What other ancient civilizations do you find interesting?
What other ancient civilizations do I find interesting? Was that the question?
Yes. Correct.
Obviously, we know your favorite, but whatever.
We know Egypt's your favorite.
Well, I'm particularly interested in the civilizations that ancient Egypt had contact with. So, and in fact, my specialism is actually not so much Tutankhamun as the period afterwards, when Egypt comes into contact with lots of different ancient civilizations. The one that I know best is the kingdom called Kush. And Kush was a very powerful kingdom, which we have up until recently not really known very much about. And most of what we have learned about it has come from Egyptologists. And that's meant that we've looked at it in a slightly sort of biased way, a little bit as though it was not as good as Egypt. And Egypt's next door neighbor in what's now Sudan, to the south of Egypt. But we've tended to think of it as, Egypt's inferior neighbor. But we are beginning to understand that although in many ways Kush was similar to Egypt, after a while they worshipped similar gods. They used the hieroglyphic script. Their temples and their gods kind of looked like Egyptian temples and Egyptian gods, but they were distinctive. And the Kushites had their own language, they had their own burial customs, they had their own architecture, they had their own country, and in fact at times they were powerful enough to invade Egypt and take it over. So for me, the kingdom of Kush, which we, like I say, we're still catching up in terms of what we know about it, is probably the most interesting of all the other kingdoms. And actually, if I had to jump ship and specialize in a different part of the ancient world, I would love it to be Kush.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we just wanted to, okay, so it's the end of their class period, so we're gonna wrap this up, but we wanted to thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I've been doing Dubuque for almost 10 years, and you've been the star of my videos for almost 10 years now. We will be, Jamie and I will be in contact with you after this. We have a couple of further things we'd just like to ask you, and maybe on your way back from Egypt, you can.
Oh yeah, have a great trip.
Oh, enjoy your trip.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I look forward to hearing from you. Just drop me a line anytime. I can reply from Egypt anyway.
Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye, Dr. Naunton.